Just imagine you are lying in the dark, almost asleep, and you hear it. That soft, rhythmic purring beside you. Perhaps there is a warm weight on your chest or curled against your legs. A cat. Your cat on a Tuesday night like any other. But here is the crazy thing. This creature purring next to you is the culmination of a journey that spans 12,000 years. Its ancestors stalked the shadows of the world's first cities, traveled in the holds of Viking longships, survived witch hunts and plagues, and somehow convinced humans to build entire civilizations around their comfort. And we barely noticed. Today there are more than 6 million domestic cats alive on Earth. They are in penthouses in Dubai, fishing villages in Japan, farms in Iowa, and apartments in Sao Paulo. They have colonized every continent except Antarctica, and honestly, they would probably manage that too if we just built them a heated research station. But if you had looked at the world 12,000 years ago, there were no house cats. Zero. Only wild predators in the wilderness of the Middle East who wanted absolutely nothing to do with humans. So what happened? How did we get from there to here? From wild hunters avoiding people to animals deliberately seeking out our laps, our beds, our warmest spots by the fire. If you are using this to fall asleep, that is quite literally why I make it. So perhaps subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it is fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, someone in Iceland at 3 in the morning because the sun never sets. All of you drifting off to stories of cats. The story you are about to hear is not what you think. It is not really about how we domesticated cats. That is the thing. We did not domesticate them. Not in the same way we domesticated dogs, horses, or cows. Those animals we actively bred, shaped, and controlled over thousands of years. Cats. Cats domesticated themselves, and that changes everything. You see, most people think ancient humans saw a cute wildcat and decided to make it a pet. That is not how it happened. What actually happened was far stranger and far more interesting. Around 10,000 BCE, humans in the Fertile Crescent discovered agriculture. We stopped wandering, hunting, and gathering. We started staying in one place, growing grain, storing food. And you know what loves stored grain? Mice, rats, rodents of all kinds. They descended on our grain reserves like an army. And you know what loves mice and rats? Wildcats. So these little wildcats, Felis sylvestris, started hanging around human settlements. Not because they liked us, but because we had accidentally created an all-you-can-eat buffet of their favorite prey. The boldest ones, the ones that could tolerate being near humans without panicking, got access to the best hunting grounds. They ate well. They had more kittens, and those kittens inherited their parents' slightly reduced fear of humans. Generation after generation, the cats that were just a little friendlier, just a little calmer around people thrived, and we let them because they were solving our rodent problem. It was the perfect partnership, except nobody planned it. It just happened. But here's where the questions become truly interesting. Did the ancient Egyptians really worship cats? Or is that a myth we have exaggerated? How did cats survive the Middle Ages when the Catholic Church declared them servants of Satan? Why are there cat cafes in every major city, while dog cafes never really caught on? How did an animal that humans never fully controlled become one of the most successful mammals on the planet? And here is the greatest mystery of all. After 12,000 years of living with humans, cats are still only half domesticated. Dogs have been shaped by human breeding into hundreds of radically different forms. Great Danes and Chihuahuas barely look like they belong to the same species. But cats, a tabby in your living room, could still survive in the wild tomorrow if it had to. Put a golden retriever in the woods and it will be confused and frightened. Put a house cat in the woods and it will hunt, kill, and thrive. So who really domesticated whom? Perhaps the better question is, did cats look at early human civilization and decide we were useful enough to keep around? Over the next few hours, we are going to journey through the entire history of cats. From wild ancestors prowling the ancient Middle East to viral videos dominating your social media feed. We will visit ancient Egypt, where cats were sacred, medieval Europe, where they were hunted, Victorian England, where they became fashionable, and the modern internet age, where they somehow became the unofficial mascots of digital culture. It is a story nobody tells completely because it is not really in the history books. Cats have existed alongside human civilization, shaping it in quiet ways, leaving paw prints we only noticed looking back. They witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They walked the decks of ships that discovered new continents. They survived persecutions that should have wiped them out. And through it all, they never quite became ours. We simply became useful to them. So settle in. Make yourself comfortable. Let us go back, way back to a time before cities, before kingdoms, before anyone had ever heard a purr in the dark and felt comforted by it. Let us go to where it all began. 10,000 years before our era, the world is warming. The ice sheets that covered half of Europe and Asia for 100,000 years are finally retreating. Sea levels are rising, coastlines are shifting, and in a crescent-shaped region stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, something revolutionary is about to happen. Humans are about to stop wandering. They do not know it yet, but when they do, they will need help. And that help will come from a small, tortoise-shell-colored predator that has been watching them from the shadows for thousands of years. Meet Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat. The great-great-great-grandmother of your cat, going back some 10,000 generations. She weighs maybe 8 pounds, stands about 10 inches at the shoulder, and would fit comfortably in your backpack. She has sandy-colored fur with faint stripes on her legs and tail, a white belly, and eyes that glow with an amber light in the reflection of human campfires. She is a solitary huntress. She needs no one. She has been surviving perfectly well on her own for hundreds of thousands of years. Thank you very much. But she is about to make a choice that will change everything, not just for her species, but for humanity itself. The genetic evidence is remarkable. In 2007, researchers analyzed the DNA of nearly 1,000 domestic cats from around the world, along with samples from the 5 subspecies of wild cats. They were looking for the point of origin, the ancestral population that gave rise to every house cat living today. What they found was startling, not because it was ambiguous, but because it was so incredibly clear. Every domestic cat, from the Maine Coon to the Siamese, from the Egyptian Mao to the alley cat in Tokyo, all trace their maternal lineage back to Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat. And not just any African wildcat, but specifically the populations living in the Near East, in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent. This is where the story truly begins. Imagine the landscape. It is not the desert you might picture when you hear Near East or Middle East. 10,000 years ago, this region is lush. Rolling grasslands stretch for hundreds of miles. Oak forests cover the hillsides. Rivers flow year-round, fed by mountain snowmelt and seasonal rains. Wild wheat and barley grow in dense stands across the valleys. Herds of gazelles graze on the plains. Wild boars root through the forests. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there are rodents. Mice, rats, voles, gerbils, ground squirrels. They are thriving in this post-glacial abundance, multiplying faster than predators can control them. And the wildcats, they are in paradise. A solitary African wildcat needs to catch about 4 or 5 rodents a day to survive. In this environment, that is easy. They hunt at dawn and dusk. They are crepuscular predators, taking advantage of the low light when rodents are most active, but larger predators are less effective. Their hearing is phenomenal. They can detect the ultrasonic squeaks of mice from dozens of feet away. Their eyes possess a tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer that amplifies available light, allowing them to see in conditions that would leave other predators stumbling blind. They are perfectly adapted ambush hunters, patient, silent, and deadly. But here is what is crucial. They are not pack animals. They are not social. Each wildcat maintains a territory of several square miles. Males and females only come together briefly to mate, then part ways. Mothers raise their kittens alone for a few months, teaching them to hunt, and then drive them off to find their own territory. This is not a species that cooperates. It is a species that tolerates absolutely no competition for resources within its hunting grounds. Put 2 wildcats in the same territory and they will fight viciously until one leaves or dies. So why were they domesticated when other wildcats were not? That is the fascinating question, because Felis sylvestris libica is not the only wildcat subspecies. There are 5 main groups, all descending from a common ancestor that lived about 1 million years ago. The European wildcat, Felis sylvestris sylvestris, is larger and more aggressive with thicker fur and a bushier tail. Beautiful animals, but absolutely untamable. Conservationists have been trying for decades to breed European wildcats in captivity, and they remain as wild in the 20th generation as they were in the first. Even hand-raised from birth European wildcat kittens grow into animals that will never tolerate human contact. The Asian wildcats scattered from India to China are equally resistant to domestication. There is evidence that ancient Chinese populations attempted to domesticate the leopard cat, Prianolurus bengalensis, around 5,000 years ago. Archaeological sites in China contain leopard cat bones showing they lived alongside humans, but it did not last. Whatever relationship developed, it did not persist. Today's Chinese domestic cats all descend from the same Near Eastern populations as the cats everywhere else in the world. So what made Felis sylvestris libica different? The answer seems to be temperament, not exactly friendliness. No one is claiming these wildcats were naturally cuddly, but they had a higher tolerance for stress, a lower threshold for aggression in the face of unusual situations. When something changed in their environment, European wildcats would flee or fight. African wildcats were more inclined to watch and wait to evaluate whether the change presented a danger or an opportunity. This tiny difference in baseline temperament was enough, because when humans started settling down in the Fertile Crescent, they created the opportunity of a lifetime for any wildcat bold enough to take it. The genetic studies that pinpointed this origin are remarkable works of scientific detective work. Researchers did not just study modern cats. They extracted DNA from archaeological cat bones found in ancient human settlements across the Near East, Europe, and Africa. Some of these bones were 9,000 years old. By comparing ancient and modern DNA, they could track how cats spread from their point of origin. The data shows at least 5 distinct maternal lineages, 5 separate groups of African wildcats that contributed to the domestic cat gene pool. But all 5 groups lived in the same region, the Fertile Crescent, in what is now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and Jordan. Even more remarkably, the process of domestication left almost no mark on the cat's genetics. This is completely different from dogs, sheep, cattle, or virtually any other domestic animal. Dog domestication involved massive genetic changes. Modern dogs look nothing like wolves. Their bones are different, their brains are smaller, their behavior is radically transformed. Thousands of years of selective breeding have created hundreds of distinct breeds, each specialized for different tasks. Cats. Cats are fundamentally still wildcats. A domestic cat and an African wildcat can mate and produce fertile offspring. Their skeletons are nearly identical. Up until about 200 years ago, you literally could not tell the skeleton of a domestic cat from that of a wildcat just by looking at the bones. This tells us something profound about how cat domestication happened. It was not selective breeding, not at first. For thousands of years, humans did not capture wildcats to breed the tamest ones, as they did with wolves. Cats domesticated themselves. They chose us. Or, more accurately, they chose the ecological niche we created. Think about what those early wildcats were. Solitary, territorial, crepuscular hunters that spent most of the day sleeping in hidden spots, emerging at dawn and dusk to hunt. Their diet consisted almost entirely of small rodents, supplemented occasionally by birds, lizards, or large insects. They were ambush predators, not pursuit hunters. They would find a good spot near rodent trails or burrows, sit completely motionless for hours if necessary, and then explode into action when the prey appeared. The attack lasted seconds. The meal was consumed quickly, often in the same spot where the kill occurred, then back to a resting place to sleep and digest. They were also incredibly efficient predators. Studies on modern African wildcats show they have a hunting success rate of about 60%. That is extraordinary. Lions might succeed 25% of the time. Cheetahs, despite their incredible speed, only catch their prey in about half their hunts. Wildcats, hunting creatures a fraction of their size in the grass and brush, succeed more often than almost any other carnivore. This efficiency meant they did not need massive territories if prey was abundant. Under optimal conditions, a wildcat could maintain a territory of just 1 or 2 square miles. Now imagine what happens when humans begin to settle down. When they stop moving with the seasons and start building permanent camps. When they start cultivating wheat and barley, storing the harvested grain in granaries and storage pits. When they begin to create the first concentrated year-round food sources in human history, The rodents notice immediately. Mice and rats had been following humans opportunistically for millennia, scavenging scraps in camps, raiding food stashes. But permanent settlements with grain storage, that is paradise. Rodent populations explode around these early farming villages. Archaeological evidence shows massive increases in rodent species like house mice animals adapted to living alongside humans. Right around the time permanent settlements appear, and the wildcats notice the rodents. A village with grain reserves is surrounded by the highest density of prey these cats have ever encountered. More rodents in a 100-yard radius than they would normally find in their entire territory. And they are easy to catch. Emboldened by the abundance, careless around the food sources. For a wildcat willing to overcome its natural wariness of humans, willing to hunt in the shadows around human camps, the reward is enormous. So they came. Not all at once. Not as a species. Individual cats bolder than average, hungry enough or curious enough to take the risk. They discovered that humans, busy with their farming, their pottery, and their increasingly complex social lives, mostly ignored them. Perhaps they threw the occasional stone if a cat got too close during the day. But generally humans tolerated them, because they had noticed something too. Villages with cats had fewer rodents, grain reserves lasted longer, diseases spread less easily. These early farmers did not understand germ theory. They did not know that rodents carried plague, typhus, and a dozen other deadly infections. But they understood cause and effect. Cats around meant fewer rats. Fewer rats meant more food survived to feed the village through the winter. A partnership was forming. Not friendship yet, not trust, but a mutual tolerance based on mutual benefit. The cats got easy hunting, the humans got pest control, and both species got something else. Something neither could have predicted. They got each other. For the next 12,000 years, these two species would go on to shape each other in ways that would ultimately lead to cat videos hitting 1 billion views on the internet. But that was far in the future. For now, in the first light of dawn of the Neolithic Revolution, there were just a few wildcats creeping closer to human camps, taking the first hesitant steps toward a relationship that would take them across the entire globe. The era of the domestic cat was beginning. Picture this, we are roughly 10,000 years before our era. The Ice Age is finally releasing its grip. Your ancestors have spent the last 50,000 years as nomadic hunter-gatherers, following herds of game foraging for wild plants, living in temporary camps that you abandon when resources run low. But something is changing. In a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching from modern Egypt through Israel, Syria, and Iraq to the Persian Gulf. People are starting to notice something interesting. Those wild grasses they have been harvesting, the ones with the large seed heads, grow back in the same spots year after year. And if you pay attention to how you harvest them, if you leave a few seeds behind or perhaps deliberately scatter them, you get even more plants the following season. It is the dawn of agriculture, and it is about to create the perfect environment for one of the most successful partnerships in human history. A partnership nobody planned. A relationship that would change both species involved in ways neither could have foreseen. Because when humans started farming, they accidentally sent out an invitation. And cats, wild cats, living their own independent lives for millions of years, decided to accept. But let us back up. Before we get to the partnership, we have to understand what humans were building. The transition to agriculture was not a sudden revolution. It was a gradual shift that took thousands of years. Early farmers did not abandon hunting and gathering overnight. They supplemented wild foods with cultivated grains, slowly increasing their reliance on crops as they figured out better techniques. And with cultivation came a new revolutionary challenge: storage. You cannot store wild game meat for months, not effectively, not in a world before refrigeration. But grain you can store. Grain you can keep in pits lined with clay or stone. Grain you can stockpile to feed yourself through the winter, to plant the next season, to trade with neighboring communities. For the first time in human history, people were accumulating massive surpluses of food, and they were keeping those surpluses in one place. Concentrated, predictable, accessible. For humans, it was revolutionary. For mice and rats, it was heaven. Wild rodents had always been around, scavenging whatever they could find. But now humans had created something unprecedented. Massive concentrations of their absolute favorite food, conveniently stored in structures that provided shelter from the weather and predators. Within a few generations of the first grain storage experiments, mouse populations around human settlements exploded. Archaeological sites of early farming communities show staggering numbers of rodent remains. Some storage pits show evidence of losing 30–40% of their contents to rodent damage. Early farmers tried everything. They dug deeper pits. They lined them with materials mice could not chew through. They set traps. They hunted the rodents themselves. But it was a losing battle. Mice breed at an insane rate. A single breeding pair can produce dozens of offspring in a season, and those offspring can start breeding in a matter of weeks. You cannot kill mice faster than they reproduce. Not with Neolithic technology, not by hand. But something else could. Something that had been hunting mice for millions of years, long before humans ever started farming. Something small enough to follow mice into their burrows, fast enough to catch them in the open, patient enough to wait by their holes for hours. Something perfectly engineered by evolution to be the ultimate mouse-killing machine. Cats, specifically Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat. These were not the domesticated house cats we know today. They were wild predators, solitary hunters living in the forests and grasslands around the Fertile Crescent. They hunted alone, avoided other cats except during mating season, and wanted absolutely nothing to do with humans. They were shy, cautious, perfectly capable of surviving without any human contact. But they were also pragmatic, and they knew a good opportunity when they saw one. Imagine you are one of these wildcats. You have been hunting your territory for years, catching enough mice and small birds to survive, but always working for every meal. Competition from other predators, limited prey populations, long hours of stalking and chasing. Then one day you notice something strange. There is a human settlement in your territory. You avoid it at first. Naturally. Humans are dangerous, unpredictable. Best to stay away. But you also notice the mice. They are everywhere around the camp. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, fat and slow from eating stored grain. More mice than you have ever seen in your life, all concentrated in one small area. You start hunting near the settlement, just on the edges at first, staying hidden, ready to bolt if the humans get too close. But the hunting is incredible. You can catch more mice in an hour than you used to catch in a day. And the humans, they mostly ignore you. As long as you stay out of their way. Do not threaten their children or steal their food, they let you hunt. Some of them even seem pleased when they see you carrying off dead mice. After a few weeks, you are spending most of your time around the camp. Why hunt in the wild when the prey is so much easier here? That is how it started. Not with humans capturing and taming wildcats. Not with deliberate domestication. With cats making a calculated decision that life near humans, despite the risks, offered significant benefits. Scientists call this self-domestication. Animals choose to associate with humans, selecting themselves for the partnership based on their own evaluation of costs and benefits. It is completely different from how dogs were domesticated. Dogs became our partners through deliberate breeding and training, likely starting with tamed wolves that helped with the hunt. That partnership was intentional on both sides. Humans wanted hunting partners, wolves wanted access to food and protection. But cats just showed up. And not every cat made the same choice. Archaeological evidence suggests that only certain wildcats started hanging around human camps. Probably the ones that were naturally less fearful, more curious, better able to tolerate proximity to humans and to other cats. Because here is the catch. To successfully exploit human settlements, cats had to change one of their fundamental behaviors. They had to become less territorial. In the wild, cats are solitary. Each cat maintains its own hunting territory and aggressively chases away others. But around human settlements, with their concentrated prey, multiple cats could coexist in a small area. The food supply was so abundant that competition was unnecessary. Cats that could tolerate other cats that could share space without constantly fighting got access to the best hunting. The ones that could not stayed in the wild. Over hundreds of generations, this created unprecedented selection pressure on wildcats. The most socially tolerant individuals thrived around humans, raised more kittens, and passed on their genes. The more aggressive solitary individuals remained wild. Slowly, gradually, a new population emerged. Cats that looked like wildcats, hunted like wildcats, but behaved slightly differently. More tolerant of humans, more tolerant of each other. Not yet domesticated, not really, but moving in that direction. Humans noticed. How could they not? Their grain reserves were being protected by these efficient little predators. Rodent losses dropped dramatically. The cats asked for nothing. They did not need training or feeding. They simply hunted. And in doing so, they saved the harvest. In a world where a bad harvest meant starvation, where rodent damage could be the difference between survival and death, cats became incredibly valuable. Not as pets, not yet, but as partners. Useful animals that had chosen to live alongside humans. We know this happened because we have found the evidence. On the island of Cyprus, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary. A 9,500-year-old grave containing the remains of a human adult and a young cat buried together deliberately in what was clearly an intentional funeral. This is remarkable for several reasons. First, Cyprus has no native wildcats. Cats do not swim. The only way cats got to Cyprus is if humans brought them on boats, which means that 9,500 years ago, humans valued cats enough to transport them to new territories. Second, the burial suggests emotional attachment. You do not bury your exterminator in a formal grave with funerary offerings unless you feel something for them. This was no longer just a working relationship. It was the beginning of affection. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this grave predates the height of the Egyptian cat cult by 6,000 years. The story of cats and humans did not begin in Egypt as popular culture often suggests. It began much earlier in the small farming communities of the Neolithic Revolution. From those early settlements, the partnership spread. As agriculture expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually into Europe and Asia, cats followed. Or rather, humans brought them along. When founding new settlements, they brought grain, tools, livestock, and cats. Because by this point, cats were really no longer optional. They were essential infrastructure. Without a cat, your grain reserves were vulnerable. With cats, you had a fighting chance to preserve your harvest. The relationship was still fundamentally utilitarian. Cats were working animals, not companions. They lived around human camps, but not necessarily inside human homes. They hunted for themselves, raised their kittens in hidden spots, away from human interference, and maintained much of their wild independence. But they were also becoming something new, more comfortable with humans than their wild ancestors, more diverse in their coloring, because genetic mutations that would have been a disadvantage in the wild, making the animals more visible to prey, did not matter as much in an environment where rodents were abundant and easy to catch. Archaeological sites across the ancient Near East show increasing evidence of cat remains alongside human settlements, not as prey animals. The bones do not show butchery marks, but as residents. 7,000 years ago, cat bones were common in farming sites from Turkey to Israel to Egypt. Some sites show cat paw prints in clay bricks that had been left out to dry in the sun. Cats had casually walked across them, comfortable enough around humans to stroll through active construction sites. 6,000 years ago, artistic representations of cats begin to appear. Figurines, carved decorations, wall paintings. Humans were no longer just tolerating cats, they were noticing them, thinking about them, integrating them into their cultural expression. The stage was set for what came next. For the civilization that would take the human-cat relationship to entirely new heights, transforming cats from useful pest controllers into sacred animals, divine representatives, walking among mortals. But that transformation was still thousands of years away. For now, in these early farming communities, cats and humans were simply learning to live together. Two species, each pursuing its own interests, discovering that cooperation benefited them both. It was not yet love, it was not yet worship, it was just the beginning, the first hesitant steps of a partnership that would eventually span the globe and last for 12,000 years. Around 2,000 years before our era, something extraordinary began to happen along the Nile. The practical pest controllers that had been living in Egyptian granaries for over 1,000 years started appearing in places that would have seemed impossible a few generations earlier. Temple walls, royal tombs, religious ceremonies. Cats were no longer just tolerated, they were revered. The transformation did not happen overnight. The oldest Egyptian artwork showing cats date back to around 2500 BCE. Simple paintings depicting them doing what they did best, hunting birds in the papyrus marshes, sitting under grain storage facilities, looking alert and predatory. They were painted the same way one might paint any useful animal, with an appreciation for their function, but without any particular veneration. But then something shifted. Around 2000 BCE, cats were painted differently. Now they appeared wearing collars, sitting on chairs next to their owners, being hand-fed choice scraps of fish. And most tellingly of all, appearing in religious contexts, their images carved into temple walls alongside gods and pharaohs. What changed? Probably several things at once. After centuries of living alongside humans, cats had become more than just exterminators. They had become companions. Egyptian families who had grown up with cats protecting their food supply had developed a genuine affection for them. Children had played with kittens. Adults had enjoyed the comfort of a purring presence during the cold desert nights. The practical relationship had become an emotional one, but there was something else. The Egyptians had begun to notice things about cats that aligned uncannily well with their religious beliefs. Cats were liminal creatures, active at dawn and dusk, moving between day and night. They could see in the dark when humans were blind. Their eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. They were both gentle with their families and absolutely deadly to their prey. They killed snakes, including the venomous cobras that infested Egyptian homes. Most importantly, cats were extraordinarily devoted mothers, fiercely protective of their kittens. For a civilization obsessed with divine duality, the balance between creation and destruction, protection and power, cats seemed to be perfect vessels for the sacred. And so began their transformation from useful animals to living gods. The goddess Bastet became the focal point of this transformation. Though her origins were more complex and darker than many realize, she did not start out as a cat goddess at all. Originally, she was depicted as a lioness, one of several fierce feline deities representing the destructive power of the sun and the military might of the pharaoh. In her early forms, Bastet was almost indistinguishable from Sekhmet, the terrifying lioness goddess who nearly destroyed humanity in ancient myths. But around 1000 BCE, Bastet began to change. The fierce lioness softened into a domestic cat, or a woman with the head of a cat. Her role shifted from divine warrior to protector of the home, guardian of pregnant women, goddess of fertility and domesticity. This transformation mirrored the evolution of the cat itself in Egyptian society, from wild predator to guardian of the hearth, from fearsome hunter to beloved companion. The change was not random. It reflected a fundamental shift in Egyptian culture. As the new kingdom gave way to later periods, Egypt became less focused on military conquest and more concerned with domestic prosperity. The gods adapted to meet human needs. Bastet became the perfect deity for this new era, powerful enough to protect, but gentle enough to love. Her cult was centered in the city of Bubastis in the Nile Delta, where a massive temple complex was dedicated in her honor. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus visited Bubastis around 450 BCE, and left us one of the most detailed descriptions we have of the Egyptian cat cult. He wrote with barely concealed astonishment about the annual festival of Bastet, claiming it was the largest religious gathering in Egypt. According to his account, 700,000 people traveled to Bubastis for the celebration, arriving by boat with musicians, dancers, and copious amounts of wine. The festival was loud, joyous, more of a carnival than a solemn ceremony. People drank, sang, made offerings, and celebrated the goddess who protected their homes and blessed them with children. But the most remarkable thing about the Temple of Bastet was not the festival. It was the cats. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of cats lived within the temple complex, cared for by priests and priestesses who considered it their sacred duty. These were not wild animals, barely tolerating human presence. These were cats that had been bred for generations in the service of religion, raised specifically to embody the goddess. Pilgrims brought them offerings, special foods, toys, even jewelry. Some of these temple cats wore elaborate collars made of gold and precious stones. When they died, they were mummified with the same care given to human nobility, which brings us to one of the strangest and most fascinating aspects of the Egyptian cat cult: the mummies. Millions of them. In the late 1800s, when European archaeologists first began seriously excavating Egyptian animal cemeteries, they were unprepared for the sheer scale of what they found. A single site, the cat cemetery at Bubastis, contained an estimated 300,000 mummified cats. Another site near Beni Hassan held hundreds of thousands more. The mummification was not crude or rushed. These cats were prepared using techniques similar to those used for human mummies, though slightly less elaborate. Their internal organs were removed. Their bodies were treated with natron salt to preserve them. They were wrapped in linen with geometric patterns and placed in specially made containers, ranging from simple pottery jars to elaborate painted wooden coffins. Why so many mummies? Partly because cats were genuinely loved, and families wanted to ensure their pets would be with them in the afterlife, but also because a massive religious industry had grown up around cat mummification. People who could not afford to mummify their own cats could buy pre-mummified cats as offerings to Bastet. Some were kittens bred specifically for this purpose, humanely killed and prepared by the temple priests. It is unsettling to modern sensibilities, but in the context of ancient Egyptian religion, it made perfect sense. If you wanted to honor Bastet, you offered her the thing she loved most: a cat. Respect for cats in daily life was equally intense. Egyptian law protected cats with penalties that seem wildly disproportionate to what we would consider reasonable today. Several ancient sources claim that anyone who killed a cat, even accidentally, could face the death penalty. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described seeing a Roman visitor who had accidentally killed a cat being torn apart by an angry Egyptian mob, despite desperate attempts by Egyptian officials to save him. This might be exaggerated. Ancient historians loved a good dramatic story, but multiple sources mention similar incidents. The fear of harming a cat was real and widespread. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Egyptian artwork consistently shows cats in positions of comfort and privilege. Funerary paintings depict them sitting on cushioned chairs, beneath their owners' seats at banquets, wearing jeweled collars and eating from bowls. One famous painting shows a cat being hand-fed from a table laden with food while birds hang overhead, completely ignored because keeping the cat happy is more important than guarding the meat supply. These were not working animals given the bare minimum. They were pampered family members. DNA evidence suggests that something remarkable happened during this period. Cats living in Egypt around 1000 BCE showed genetic signatures of intensive breeding and selection. The Egyptians were no longer just keeping the wild cats that wandered into their grain stores. They were actively breeding cats, selecting for specific traits, probably temperament. Cats friendly enough to live comfortably with humans, and possibly appearance, though we cannot be certain what physical traits they valued. But certainly by breeding them systematically, they were creating the foundation of the domestic cat as we know it today. The temple complexes became breeding centers with hundreds of cats living in close proximity, cared for by humans. Genetic diversity would have rapidly decreased. Certain lineages would have dominated. This is exactly what we see in the genetic record, a bottleneck around 1000 BCE in the feline lineage that gave rise to most modern domestic cats. Not a crisis-driven bottleneck like the one that nearly wiped out humanity, but a breeding bottleneck, the signature of intentional selection by human breeders. But Egypt jealously guarded its sacred cats, recognizing their value both religiously and practically. Egyptian authorities attempted to ban the export of cats out of Egypt. Merchants caught trading cats faced heavy penalties. The goal was to keep these divine animals exclusively Egyptian, maintaining a monopoly on both their practical benefits and their religious significance. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Whenever a commodity becomes valuable and one group tries to monopolize it, smuggling becomes inevitable. Phoenician traders, famous for moving anything profitable across the Mediterranean, began secretly transporting cats out of Egypt, hidden in cargo holds concealed among other goods, likely breeding them on ships during long voyages. Greek merchants did the same. Roman traders followed. By 500 BCE, cats almost certainly descending from Egyptian stock were appearing in Greece, Cyprus, and along the Mediterranean coast. The Egyptian religious monopoly on cats was crumbling. But in Egypt itself, the adoration continued. Bastet remained one of the most popular deities throughout the Ptolemaic period. Even as Greek culture blended with Egyptian traditions after the conquest of Alexander, the temple at Bubastis kept operating. Pilgrims still came for the festivals. Cats were still mummified by the thousands. Then Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BCE, and everything changed. Not immediately. The Romans were generally tolerant of local religions in their conquered territories, but they did not share the Egyptians' reverence for cats. To Roman sensibilities, the Egyptian obsession with felines seemed bizarre, even ridiculous. They had their own sacred animals, and cats were not among them. More importantly, Roman pragmatism clashed with the Egyptian divine economy. The massive temple complexes with their thousands of priests tending to thousands of cats, all supported by tax revenue and donations, struck Roman administrators as a waste of resources. Over the following centuries, funding for the temple complexes was gradually reduced. Priests moved on to other occupations. The grand festivals became smaller, less frequent, and eventually disappeared entirely. The cat cemeteries fell into disuse. By 400 CE, the cult of Bastet had effectively ended, suppressed partly by Roman practicality, and finally finished off by the rise of Christianity, which had no patience for animal worship of any kind. But the cats themselves survived. Centuries of breeding and selection had created an animal perfectly adapted to living alongside humans. They had spread across the Mediterranean world. They might have lost their divinity, but they had gained something equally valuable: ubiquity. The Egyptian experiment with cat worship was over. But the partnership between cats and humans, refined and intensified along the Nile, was about to keep spreading across the globe. The descendants of Bastet's sacred hunters were about to conquer the world. The Phoenicians were not trying to change the world when they smuggled cats out of Egypt. They were just solving a problem. Grain shipments across the Mediterranean were being destroyed by rats and mice. The economics were simple. A cargo ship could carry enough wheat to feed a city for weeks. But if rodents got into the hold during a 3-week voyage, you arrived with half your profit eaten and the rest contaminated with droppings. The Phoenicians needed a solution, and they found one strolling the docks of Egyptian ports. Egyptian law technically forbade the export of cats. They were sacred animals, the property of the goddess Bastet, not commodities for foreign trade. But laws only work if you can enforce them, and the Mediterranean is a large space with a lot of coastline. Phoenician merchants began acquiring cats probably through a combination of theft, bribery, and strategically breeding cats that had wandered away from Egyptian control. Within a few generations, Phoenician ships sailing out of Tyre and Sidon carried a secret weapon in their holds: efficient, tireless little hunters that worked for nothing more than the rats they caught. This was the first great feline diaspora. Not a planned colonization, not a deliberate introduction, but a practical necessity that changed the course of history. Every Phoenician trading post from Gibraltar to Carthage, from Sicily to the Levantine coast, every warehouse and granary that stored their goods became a potential habitat for cats. And cats, being cats, did not stay in the warehouses. They wandered into the towns, bred in the alleys, and gradually became an integral part of the urban ecosystem across the Mediterranean world. But it was not a rapid conquest. We are talking about centuries, perhaps nearly 1,000 years, for cats to go from Egyptian exclusivity to Mediterranean commonplace. The timeline was slow because cats faced competition. Other animals had already occupied the pest control niche in most places, and they had been doing it for a long time. In ancient Greece, cats were a curiosity, not a common sight. If you walk through Athens in the 5th century BCE, you probably would not see a single cat. Perhaps one or two kept by wealthy merchants with Mediterranean trade connections shown off as exotic pets. The Greeks had ferrets. They had domesticated them centuries earlier, trained them to hunt rats in grain stores and snakes in gardens. Ferrets were smaller, more easily controlled, and they had been part of Greek culture long enough to appear in art and literature. Weasels were even more common, semi-wild animals that people tolerated and sometimes encouraged around their property because they killed rodents and snakes. So when cats started appearing in Greek ports brought by Phoenician and later Roman traders, they were not immediately embraced. They were foreign, associated with Egypt and its strange animal-worshipping religion. And they did nothing a good ferret couldn't do better. Or at least that is what the Greeks thought. But cats had advantages that became obvious over time. Ferrets required cages training and careful handling. Weasels were unpredictable, sometimes killing chickens or attacking small pets. Cats remarkably managed themselves. Feed them occasionally, and they would stick around. Ignore them completely, and they would still control your rodent problem. They were low-maintenance solutions to a persistent issue. Gradually, over centuries, Greek attitudes shifted. By the Hellenistic period, cats were making appearances in Greek art, usually in domestic scenes, sometimes playing with balls of yarn or being fed by women and children. They were still not ubiquitous, but they had transitioned from exotic novelties to accepted, if not beloved, household pets. The Romans were more pragmatic about cats right from the start. They appreciated efficiency, and cats were efficient. Roman granaries, those massive warehouses that stored grain for the armies and cities of the empire, had serious rodent problems. Rats and mice could destroy enough grain in a single warehouse to feed a legion for months. The Romans tried everything. Architectural solutions like raised floors and smooth walls. Chemical deterrents, traps even professional rat catchers with dogs and clubs. Nothing worked as well as cats. So the Romans bred them, transported them, and established them in every major granary, from Britannia to Egypt, from Hispania to Syria. Military camps kept cats for the same reason. An army marches on its stomach, and an army's food supply travels in wagons vulnerable to rodent infestations. Cats became a part of military logistics, unofficial members of the legion, earning their keep by protecting the food supply. But something else happened in Rome, something that had not quite happened in Greece. Some Romans started to love cats, not just appreciate their utility, but genuinely enjoy their company. We have Roman mosaics showing cats in comfortable domestic settings, not working in granaries but lounging in villas being hand-fed. We have Roman tombstones for pet cats inscribed with affectionate epitaphs mourning their loss. It was not universal. Roman culture never embraced cats the way Egypt had, but it was real. For the first time outside of Egypt, cats were transitioning from working animals to companions. While cats were establishing themselves around the Mediterranean, other populations were traveling east along the Silk Road. This was not a single road, of course, but a network of trade routes connecting the Roman Empire to Central Asia, India, and ultimately China. Merchants traveling these routes faced the same problems as maritime traders. Valuable goods vulnerable to rodent damage during long, slow journeys across deserts and mountains. Cats offered the same solution. The journey was harder than the Mediterranean spread. The Silk Road routes crossed environments for which cats had not evolved. High-altitude mountain passes with thin, cold air. Deserts where water was scarce and prey was sparse. But cats are remarkably adaptable, and they had help. The merchants who had invested in cats for their caravans had a vested interest in keeping them alive. The cats that survived the journey were the toughest, the most adaptable, the ones with genetic variations that helped them handle environmental stress. Over centuries, cat populations established themselves in the trading cities along the Silk Road. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, cities where East met West, and where goods from 3 continents changed hands. Each city became a hub for local cat populations, breeding and adapting to local conditions, then spreading further as merchants resumed their routes. India received cats from multiple directions. Some arrived overland through Central Asia, traveling with merchants and settling in northern cities. Others arrived by sea, carried on ships trading between Roman Egypt and Indian ports on the west coast. The timeline is blurry. We do not have precise dates for when cats first established populations in India, but genetic evidence suggests it happened between 1500 and 2000 years ago. Hindu culture had a complicated relationship with animals, and cats fit awkwardly into the existing frameworks. They were not sacred like cows or elephants. They were not clearly beneficial like horses or oxen. They occupied an ambiguous space, useful for rodent control, but associated with independence and nocturnal hunting that made them seem mysterious, potentially dangerous. Some Hindu texts mention cats negatively, as symbols of deception or ingratitude. Others treat them neutrally as ordinary animals with no particular spiritual significance. This ambivalence would persist for centuries. Cats in India remained working animals, tolerated, but rarely beloved. China received cats even later than India, likely not establishing significant populations until about 1500 years ago. This seems strange. China had sophisticated agriculture, dense urban populations, and severe rodent problems. Why did it take so long for cats to arrive? The answer is probably competition. China had already domesticated other animals for rodent control, particularly certain breeds of small dogs, and more effectively various species of snakes that people encouraged around granaries and homes. Cats had to offer something these established solutions did not. What they offered was companionship. Chinese culture, particularly among the educated elite, valued refinement, elegance, and aesthetic appreciation. Cats, with their graceful movements, meticulous grooming, and quiet dignity, appealed to these values in a way that snakes and ratting dogs could not match. During the Tang Dynasty, cats appeared in Chinese poetry and art, not just as working animals, but as objects of aesthetic contemplation. It was a different kind of acceptance than cats had found in Rome or Greece, based less on practical utility and more on a cultural appreciation of their intrinsic qualities. But the most remarkable introduction of cats occurred at the very edge of the ancient trading world, in Japan. The Japanese islands were isolated, separated from the Asian mainland by an ocean vast enough that most animals could not reach them naturally. Cats certainly could not. They had to be deliberately transported by boat, and this did not happen until surprisingly late, probably not until about 1,200 years ago. When cats finally arrived in Japan, they came as an elite import. The first cats were gifts to the imperial court, exotic animals from China, presented in tribute. The emperor kept them as palace pets, rare and precious. For generations, cats in Japan remained associated with the aristocracy, animals too valuable to be left to roam free. They were kept indoors, sometimes on leashes, protected and pampered. This artificial scarcity created cultural associations that would persist even after cats became common. In Japanese culture, cats retained an air of refinement and mystery, creatures that had once belonged only to emperors. But underlying all these cultural histories, all these regional variations in how different societies received and perceived cats, was a more fundamental story. The story of the ship cats, the unsung heroes of maritime trade who made the entire feline diaspora possible. Every cat population outside of Egypt ultimately descended from cats that had survived sea voyages. And surviving at sea was not easy. Ships were dangerous environments. Storms could wash animals overboard. Disease spread quickly in confined spaces. Food and fresh water were limited. But ships also had something cats desperately needed: rats. Massive populations of rats breeding in the holds, nesting in the cargo, and spreading disease among the crew. A good ship's cat could mean the difference between a profitable voyage and a disaster. Merchants knew this, captains knew this, and they selected for it. The cats that became ancestral to global populations were the ones that could survive storms, tolerate weeks at sea without fresh water, hunt efficiently in dark, cramped spaces, and coexist with humans in extremely tight quarters. These were not typical cats. They were specialists, bred and selected for maritime life over hundreds of generations. And their descendants, spreading from port to port, carried these adaptations with them. The cats that eventually colonized the entire globe were already adapted to traveling to strange environments, to making themselves useful to humans under difficult conditions. They were, in a sense, pre-adapted for global conquest before the conquest even began. By the early medieval period, perhaps 1,500 years ago, cats had established populations across most of the known world. From Britain to Japan, from Scandinavia to India, cats were a consistent presence in most major cities and many rural areas. They were not equally common everywhere. Some regions still preferred other solutions to rodent problems, but they were available, established, ready for the next chapter in their history. A chapter that nearly destroyed them entirely. Picture a monastery in France in the early Middle Ages, around the year 700. Dawn breaks over stone walls that have stood for generations. In the grain storage rooms, a tabby cat walks silently between sacks of wheat ears pitched forward, waiting. A mouse emerges. The cat pounces. One less threat to the monastery's winter food supply. The passing monks nod in approval. This cat is doing God's work, protecting the harvest from vermin. During the first centuries of medieval Europe, this was the normal relationship between cats and humans. Practical, valued, commonplace. Cats lived in monasteries, on farms, in the homes of merchants and nobles. They were not particularly loved, not the way they had been in ancient Egypt, but they were useful. That was enough. The Benedictine rule, written in the 6th century, did not specifically mention cats, but monastic records across Europe show they were common residents of religious houses. Cats in the scriptorium keeping mice away from precious manuscripts. Cats in the kitchen protecting the food stores. Cats in the barns earning their keep with every rat they caught. Some monasteries even kept official registries of their cat populations, listing them alongside livestock and other valuable property. In the Islamic world, this practical appreciation deepened into genuine reverence. It was said that the Prophet Muhammad loved his cat Muezza so much that when the call to prayer sounded and Muezza was sleeping on the sleeve of his robe, Muhammad cut off the sleeve rather than disturb the cat. Whether this story is historically exact or not, it shaped Islam's attitude toward cats for over 1,000 years. In medieval Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, cats roamed freely in mosques and markets, protected by religious law and cultural tradition. Stray cats were fed by charitable foundations. Harming a cat could carry severe social consequences, but in Christian Europe, something was changing. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but gathering momentum like a storm brewing on the horizon. The shift had roots in theology, in politics, in the peculiar anxieties of medieval Christendom. The early church fathers had been ambivalent toward animals in general. Creatures served humanity, yes, but they could also represent temptation, sin, the base instincts that drew humans away from spiritual purity. As Christianity consolidated its power across Europe, this suspicion of the natural world intensified. Anything wild, anything that could not be entirely controlled or understood, became potentially dangerous, potentially demonic. Cats occupied a strange position in this worldview. They were domesticated, yes, but not really tame. Not like dogs, which showed obvious loyalty and obedience. Cats came and went as they pleased. They hunted at night, moved silently, appeared and disappeared like shadows. Their eyes reflected light in the dark, shining with a strange green or golden luminescence that seemed unnatural, even supernatural. And they were associated with women with the domestic sphere that the church was increasingly trying to regulate and control in the 11th and 12th centuries. The first signs of something darker began to appear in religious texts and popular folklore. Stories of witches capable of turning into cats, tales of demons taking feline form to tempt the faithful. Nothing systematic yet, just scattered references. But the foundation was being laid. Then in 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull entitled Vox in Rama. The document was primarily about combating heresy in Germany, but it included a detail that would resonate through the centuries. Gregory described a heretical ritual in which worshippers allegedly met Satan in the form of a cat, specifically a black cat or one with dark spots. They would kiss this demonic cat and swear their souls to darkness. It is doubtful such rituals ever took place. Most historians today believe these accounts were propaganda designed to justify the persecution of religious minorities and political enemies. But the papal bull gave the official sanction of the church to the idea that cats, particularly black cats, were linked to devil worship. And once that seed was planted in the medieval imagination, it grew like a weed. The association spread, not everywhere at once, not uniformly, but steadily across Europe through the 13th and 14th centuries. Black cats, above all, became objects of suspicion. Their dark fur seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They blended perfectly into the shadows. When they appeared suddenly out of the dark, it could startle even the bravest soul. In an era without streetlights where the night was truly dark and full of real dangers, the sudden appearance of glowing eyes in the pitch black must have been genuinely terrifying. Superstitions multiplied. A black cat crossing your path meant bad luck. A cat at a funeral meant the soul of the deceased was in danger. Cats seen near a sick person were stealing their breath, their life force. These beliefs varied by region and social class, but they shared a common theme. Cats were no longer just animals. They were omens, signs, potentially demonic agents operating in the mortal world. Then came the witch trials. Starting in the 15th century and accelerating throughout the 16th and 17th, a wave of paranoia swept across Europe. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft. And cats, especially black cats, became central to these accusations. The logic, if you can call it that, went like this. Witches received their power from Satan. To maintain contact with their demonic master, each witch was given a familiar. a spirit in animal form that would serve her and keep her connected to the dark forces. These familiars appeared most often in the form of cats. The trial records are horrific. Women accused of witchcraft were interrogated about their cats. Did they speak to them? Did the cats behave strangely? Did they have unusual markings? Any affection for a cat could be used as evidence of sorcery. Any cat living in the home of an accused witch was itself put on trial. And the cats suffered alongside their human companions. When a woman was condemned, her cats were often killed with her thrown into the flames at the stake, drowned, beaten to death by mobs convinced they were destroying demonic servants. In some towns, the torture of cats became a form of public entertainment. Cats thrown from the tops of towers, locked in barrels and set on fire, killed in public spectacles that drew enthusiastic crowds. The persecution was not universal. It was most intense in regions where the fervor of the witch trials was strongest. Parts of Germany, France, Scotland, England, it waxed and waned over decades and centuries. But for roughly 300 years from the late 1400s to the early 1700s, being a cat in many parts of Europe was genuinely dangerous. And being a black cat could be a death sentence. Some historians have suggested a grim irony here. During this same period, Europe was ravaged by the plague. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of the European population in the 14th century. Subsequent outbreaks continued for centuries. And the plague was spread primarily by rats. Rats carrying infected fleas that jumped to humans, spreading the bacteria responsible for the disease. The theory goes like this. By killing cats, medieval Europeans eliminated their best defense against rodent populations. With fewer cats to hunt them, rat populations exploded. More rats meant more fleas, more disease vectors, potentially worse plague outbreaks. Could the superstitious persecution of cats have worsened one of the greatest pandemics in history? It is a seductive narrative, and there might be some truth to it. But like many historical explanations, it is probably oversimplified. The transmission of the plague is complex, affected by climate, population density, sanitation practices, and dozens of other factors. Cat populations did decline in some regions, but probably not uniformly or dramatically enough to worsen the plague all on their own. And some areas with intense cat persecution were not hit any harder by the plague than regions where cats remained common. Yet the parallel is striking. At the exact historical moment when cats might have been most valuable to human survival, superstition drove many people to destroy them. It is a reminder of the danger of unfounded beliefs, of how fear and ignorance can convince people to act against their own best interests. But even during the darkest times, practical necessity often won out over superstition. Farmers still needed cats to protect grain stores. Millers needed them to keep rats out of the flour. Ship captains, even during the height of the witch trials, still brought cats aboard to control rodent populations on long voyages. These utilitarian cats continued their work often quietly, without much recognition, but also without persecution. And in the Islamic world, cats remained beloved. While European witch hunters were throwing cats into fires, the cats of Cairo were being fed through charitable endowments. While Scottish ministers preached about demonic familiars, the cats of Damascus were peacefully napping in mosque courtyards. The contrast could not be more stark. Same animal, same historical period, radically different treatment, based on nothing more than cultural beliefs. Some Europeans did speak out against the persecution. The 16th century writer Ulysses Aldrovandi argued that cats were beneficial animals deserving protection, not persecution. A few voices within the church questioned whether the hysteria of the witch trials had gone too far, though usually cautiously and without defending cats specifically. But these were minority opinions, easily drowned out by the dominant narrative of suspicion and fear. By the end of the 17th century, the worst was coming to an end. Witch trials were becoming less common, increasingly questioned by Enlightenment thinkers who demanded evidence and reason over superstition. The scientific revolution was changing how educated Europeans viewed the natural world, and practical experience was slowly teaching people what Islamic cultures and the ancient Egyptians had always known. Cats were valuable allies, not demonic enemies. But the damage was done. Centuries of persecution had embedded anti-cat superstitions deep into European folklore. Even today, many people consider black cats bad luck, avoid them on the street, hesitate to adopt them from shelters. These are the echoes of medieval fears, prejudices that outlived the specific circumstances that created them. The cats themselves, of course, survived. They always do. Through persecution and plague, through fire and fear, through centuries, when humans seemed determined to destroy them, cats endured. They kept hunting, kept surviving, kept living alongside humans, whether humans appreciated them or not. They waited patient, as always, for the world to regain its senses and remember what they had always been. Not demons or omens or familiars, but simply cats, hunters, survivors, silent witnesses to human folly, waiting for sanity to return. And eventually, slowly, sanity did return. By the end of the Middle Ages, the worst was over, but the cats did not know that yet. For centuries, they had been walking bad omens across much of Europe. Whiskered shadows, living suspects in every unexplained illness, every spoiled batch of ale, every barn fire that started without a cause. But something was beginning to shift, slowly, unevenly, like the light of dawn filtering through the edges of a shuttered window. The bonfires were burning out. The witch trials did not end overnight. They never do. In some regions, they died out early. In others, they flared up well into the 17th century. But the tide of history was turning. Skeptical judges began asking uncomfortable questions. Royal courts grew embarrassed by stories of grandmothers being burned for talking to a stray cat. Basic social psychology tells us that you cannot keep an entire population terrified forever. Fear eventually runs out of fuel. The Black Death receded. Plague became less frequent, more manageable. People no longer saw every misfortune as a personal curse. And as the terror ebbed, the equation of old woman plus cat equals witch began to look a little childish. Slowly, neighbors stopped pointing fingers at the cat on the windowsill. At first, cats simply faded back into the scenery. Barns still needed ratting, ships still needed mousers, grain still needed protecting. Even the most superstitious farmer could see the very practical difference between a barn with cats and a barn without them. One had rats, the other had food. In many villages, cats remained quietly useful, while human ideas shifted around them. The witch hunters grew old and died. Their grandchildren went to new schools, read new books, heard new sermons that talked less about demons and more about God's orderly creation. Theater troupes staged comedies that gently mocked overzealous inquisitors. What had once been deadly serious became mildly ridiculous. The cat never argued theology. It just kept catching mice. And yet, in a few particular places, cats were doing more than just surviving. They were adored. In 17th century France, behind walls thick enough to muffle the chaos of the outside world, Cardinal Richelieu was building an empire and a cattery. Richelieu, the powerful statesman behind Louis XIII, might be one of history's first great cat collectors. While he plotted alliances and wars, he lived surrounded by cats. Not one or two, dozens. He had special rooms set aside for them in his residence. Servants were reportedly assigned to their care. Food cushions, sleeping arrangements. Planned, organized, maintained. Imagine the contrast. Outside, rumors of witchcraft could still get you in trouble. Inside, one of the most feared politicians in Europe was spending quiet evenings with a lap full of purring animals. There are stories, part fact, part legend, that Richelieu included instructions for his cats in his will, ensuring they would be cared for after his death. Whether every detail is true hardly matters. The image is powerful. A prince of the church who did not reject cats as demons, but treated them as cherished companions. That kind of endorsement ripples outward. Courtiers talk, visitors notice, imitators copy. Cats were being rehabilitated from the top down. At the same time, painters across Europe were carrying out their own rescue mission, one brushstroke at a time. In Renaissance and Baroque art, cats crept into the corners of canvases like silent witnesses. Sometimes they crouched under the table in a domestic scene, eyes tracking a dropped piece of bread. Sometimes they sat at the feet of a woman reading. Sometimes in religious paintings they hid in the margins symbols whose meaning shifted with the painter and the patron. For viewers of the time, a cat in a painting was not neutral, it was a sign. In some works, especially early on, cats represented treachery, sensuality, or unchecked instinct, the opposite of discipline and piety. A cat near Judas might signal betrayal. A cat approaching a bird could represent sin stalking innocence. Old symbolic traditions die hard, but the Renaissance brought a new fascination with daily life. Painters loved to show what people actually saw in their homes. Children playing bread being sliced, dogs and cats sharing the same hearth. And the more cats appeared in ordinary tender scenes curled at the foot of a bed, playing with a child's toy, the harder it became to believe they were emissaries of hell. In the paintings of the Dutch Golden Age, you can almost feel the fur. The soft cat half asleep in a shaft of window light. The playful paw trying to swat a fish on the table. These are not demons, these are family members. Slightly mischievous, entirely alive, absolutely real. Art was giving the cat something it had not had in Europe for a long time. Emotional depth. Meanwhile, another quiet revolution was beginning. Not in churches or palaces, but in the laboratories, observatories, and notebooks of curious minds. The scientific revolution, from the 16th to the 18th century, changed how educated Europeans viewed everything. The stars, the planets, diseases, and finally, animals. Superstition and folklore did not vanish, but they had a new competitor, curiosity. Instead of asking, "Is this cat a witch's familiar?" some scholars began to ask, "What is this creature? How does it see in the dark? Why does it land on its feet?" Anatomists began sketching animals not as symbols but as specimens. They boiled down cat skeletons to understand the anatomy. They dissected eyes to study vision. They compared domestic cats to wild cats, trying to map the relationships. The cat, once wrapped in layers of myth, was becoming an object of observation. This did not mean people suddenly became kind. Vivisection and brutal experiments were common. But it did mean that fear could be replaced by explanation. If a cat's eyes glowed at night, you no longer needed a devil to explain it. You could talk about light reflecting off the tapetum lucidum, even if you did not yet have that name for it. Step by step, the unexplained shrank, and with it one of the main fuels for persecution. By the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment cats had quietly slipped into the parlors. Philosophers, writers, and intellectuals, especially in France and Britain, began keeping cats as companions. For some, it was practical. Cats kept the manuscripts free of nibbling mice. For others, it was emotional. Late nights spent reading and writing felt less lonely with a warm body on the desk. Voltaire reportedly hated dogs but tolerated cats. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, and others wrote about animals as sentient beings capable of pleasure and pain. This idea that animals had an inner life, however different from our own, shifted the moral landscape. Writers shaped the myth of the cat into something new, independent, aloof, philosophical. A creature that sat by the fire, half in the human world, half in its own private universe. Perfect company for thinkers who prided themselves on standing apart from the crowd. In letters and essays, Enlightenment figures sometimes contrasted cats with humans. People, they suggested, were greedy for approval and power. Cats, on the other hand, seemed perfectly content with sunbeams and comfort. A different kind of wisdom, a subtle rebuke to human vanity. The cat was becoming, in certain circles, a symbol of quiet skepticism. Neither demonic nor holy, just unbothered. Then came the French Revolution, and with it a new kind of symbolism. Revolutionary imagery is full of lions, roosters, eagles, bold, loud animals ready to roar or crow for liberty. But in the shadows in the pamphlets, the stories, and the minor artworks, cats sometimes appeared as symbols of something else. Personal independence. While great armies marched and heads rolled, ordinary people still lived in cramped apartments and dark alleys. For them, freedom was not just about constitutions and assemblies. It was about the ability to close a door, light a candle, and read a forbidden book with a sleeping cat on the bed. In some revolutionary and post-revolutionary imagery, cats represented the stubborn refusal to be owned in spirit, even when your body was still poor and your labor hard. A creature that chose when to come and go, that could not be easily trained to salute just any flag. In crowded Paris, stray cats wove through the chaos. They walked under the posters of new governments between the boots of soldiers, past the feet of starving crowds. Regimes rose and fell. The cats remained. Slowly in the decades following the revolution, as Europe staggered through new wars and new empires, cats found a more stable status. Ordinary companions for ordinary people, neither sacred nor cursed. Just there on the windowsills, the rooftops, the familiar stairwells. And at the dawn of the 19th century, a new phenomenon began to emerge. People did not just want cats. They wanted particular kinds of cats. Long before the Victorians turned cat breeding into a full-blown obsession, you can see hints of the cat craze appearing. Wealthy households prized unusual coats, long hair, strange colors, striking patterns. Travelers wrote home about strange silky cats in Persia, tailless cats on distant islands, elegant, slender mousers in eastern ports. Small informal exhibitions began to pop up at fairs and markets. A farmer might show off his best ratter. A merchant might bring a curious long-haired cat to show his friends. No official judges, no trophies. Just the first stirrings of the idea that a cat could be admired not just for its utility, but for its beauty. These early exhibitions were scattered, sometimes barely documented, but they set the stage for what was to come later in Victorian England. Organized cat shows, breed standards, pedigrees, the transformation of the cat from an anonymous mouser to a recognized individual. While all this was unfolding in European cities and salons, the cats themselves were traveling further than ever before. The age of exploration, which had begun centuries earlier, was still sending ships to the far corners of the globe, and on almost every ship as constant and quiet as the creaking of the masts, there were cats. Explorers heading to the Americas, merchants sailing around Africa, convicts being transported to Australia. All shared their cramped quarters with felines. The logic was simple. Ships full of grain cloth and food were a paradise for rats. Rats were a disaster for sailors. Cats were the solution. So they took them across the Atlantic to the ports of the Caribbean and the eastern coast of North America, around the Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean, up to India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. Across the Pacific to the western coast of the Americas, down into the oceans of the southern hemisphere, to Australia and New Zealand. At every port of call, some cats stayed behind, deserting the ship, getting lost, being gifted or traded, or simply walking off when the gangplank was lowered. They mated with local wildcats where they existed, or with other strays that had arrived on previous ships. New populations formed, adapted, and spread across isolated islands. These introductions would have devastating effects on native wildlife, something people would only fully understand much later. But from the cat's perspective, the world was opening up. A species that had once lived primarily in the Near East and parts of Africa now lived on almost every continent. On remote islands, in tropical ports, and cold northern cities, from Renaissance galleons to revolutionary gunboats, they had ridden human ambition across the globe. By the early 19th century, as steam engines began to replace sails and factories replaced workshops, the long rehabilitation of the cat was nearly complete. They had gone from sacred hunters of the Nile to whispered demons of the medieval night. From cherished pets to the favored companions of philosophers, from anonymous ship mousers to exotic curiosities at early fairs. They had followed us through religious upheavals, scientific revolutions, and political storms. Never in charge, never truly equals, but always present, watching with their lantern eyes as our ideas about them and about ourselves shifted. The stage was now set for their next transformation. The Victorian era was arriving, and in this age of industry and sentiment of classification and comfort, the cat was about to step fully into the role we know today. The modern house cat. Named, photographed, talked about, and more than ever before loved. The industrial age has arrived. Soot and steam and telegraph wires stretching across the sky. Trains scream through the countryside. Factories belch smoke all night. Gas lamps turn the darkness into a dull yellow haze. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise and progress, a soft little animal is quietly reinventing itself. The cat is moving indoors. For thousands of years, cats had been workers first and companions second. Ship hunters, barn guards, alley shadows. They were a useful, practical, affordable method of pest control that happened to have whiskers. People may have loved them, but society did not really have a formal place for that love. The Victorian era changed that. It started, like many Victorian things, with classification, with taking something messy and organic and turning it into categories, charts, and competitions. Imagine London, 1871, the Crystal Palace, a massive glass cathedral dedicated to industry and exhibitions, with iron ribs arching over thousands of visitors. This was where the world came to show off its wonders. Machines, inventions, exotic plants, human curiosities, and on one particular summer day, cats. Not alley cats sneaking through the crowd, not half-wild mousers lurking in the rafters, but cats in cages arranged in neat rows, looked at, judged, admired. At the center of it all stood a man named Harrison Weir, an illustrator, animal lover, and passionate organizer. He believed that cats deserved the same attention that dogs and horses were beginning to receive. Official shows, written standards, recognition. So he did something that at the time seemed almost absurd. He organized a beauty pageant for cats. They came by the dozens. Long-haired Persians, then often called Angoras. Sleek, short-haired tabbies, their stripes like poured smoke. Cats with unusual colors, striking patterns, strange faces. The catalog divided them into classes by sex, by hair length, by color. For the first time, cats were being evaluated publicly, not on how many mice they could kill, but on how they looked. Visitors strolled past the cages, whispering, pointing. Some mocked, some laughed, some were enchanted. The newspapers covered the event with a mix of amusement and fascination. But something important had happened. The 1871 Crystal Palace Cat Show transformed an invisible domestic worker into a visible object of admiration. It pulled the cat out of the shadows and placed it under the glass roof of modernity, right next to the steam engines and scientific instruments. From that moment on, the modern house cat began to take shape. The Victorians loved categories. They loved to divide, enumerate, describe, and control. Plants, skull shapes, social classes, everything could be sorted into neat little boxes. Cats were no exception. Up until this point, a cat was just a cat. You might say tabby or tortoiseshell black or white, but those were loose descriptions, not formal types. There were local variations, of course, fluffier cats in colder regions, sleek desert mousers in warmer ones, but no one had yet decided that these variations should become breeds. The Victorian breeders did just that. They started with what they could see: coat length, color pattern, face shape. A long-haired cat originating from the East was labeled a Persian. A blue-gray, short-haired cat from Britain was bundled into the emerging concept of the British Shorthair. Unusual colors, solid blacks, brilliant whites, rare oranges were isolated and crossed. The selective breeding that had already transformed wolves into dozens of dog breeds and reshaped farm animals for centuries was now being applied to the domestic cat. At first it was clumsy, standards were vague, registries incomplete, but slowly a model emerged. Enthusiasts like Harrison Weir began writing explicit descriptions: the ideal head shape, the right eye color, the correct length and texture of the fur. A good Persian was not just any long-haired cat, it was a cat that matched a carefully drafted image in a breeder's mind. Of course, the cats had no idea. All they knew was that suddenly some of them were being chosen, not for their hunting skills, but for their softness, for the roundness of their cheeks, for the way their eyes contrasted with their fur. In the quiet of Victorian parlors, humans were reinventing what a cat could be. At the same time, something even more radical was happening slowly, home by home. The cat was leaving the barn and entering the living room. Industrialization had changed how people lived in cities. The middle class was expanding. Families were moving into terraced houses and apartment buildings. Places without attics, without haylofts, without large grain stores. Fewer rats, fewer mice, more rugs and upholstered chairs. In these spaces, a cat could no longer just be a mouser. It had to be appropriate. Victorian morality valued order, cleanliness, control. The home was meant to be a sanctuary against the chaos of the street. Letting a half-wild, soot-covered alley cat wander into the parlor was unthinkable. But a well-groomed, carefully chosen, well-mannered cat, that could work. Writers and etiquette guides began talking about cats as suitable companions, particularly for women and children. Gentle, quiet, self-contained. Unlike dogs, which required walks and rough play, cats could adapt to the slower rhythm of domestic life. They could sit on a cushion, curl up in a lap, pose decoratively on a windowsill. Middle-class households began treating cats less like tools and more like family members. They were given names more often. Not just Kitty or Tom, but real human names. Their temperaments were noticed, their whims forgiven. This shift was not universal. Many cats were still working animals in stables and warehouses, but in the expanding world of respectable Victorian homes, a new archetype was crystallizing. The house cat as a full-fledged pet. With that came a second, quieter revolution. People began to worry about their welfare. The 19th century saw the birth of organized animal protection movements. Overworked and beaten horses in city streets drew much of the early attention. But slowly, cats so often neglected, abandoned, or casually abused entered the conversation. Charities and societies formed to rescue stray animals, often linked to the broader humanitarian movements that had already produced the first laws against animal cruelty. Shelters began to appear. Pamphlets were printed calling for kindness toward the humble cat, reminding readers that these animals felt pain, fear, and affection. Some Victorians campaigned specifically against the casual culling of unwanted kittens. A common practice in an era before spaying and neutering were widely accepted. Others protested the use of cats in scientific experiments, an early precursor to anti-vivisection activism. For the first time in history, organized voices were rising not just for valuable racehorses or hunting dogs, but for ordinary cats. The idea that society owed them some measure of protection was beginning to take root. Of course, ideas spread faster when the powerful and famous adopt them, and the Victorian era had no shortage of high-profile cat lovers. Queen Victoria herself owned cats and spoke fondly of them. Her endorsement mattered. When it was known that the monarch favored a species, the social status of that species rose. Owning and cherishing a cat became a little more acceptable, a little more respectable. Writers, too, put their reputations on the line for feline affection. Charles Dickens, chronicler of London streets and its hidden sorrows, kept cats that wandered over his manuscripts and entered his personal mythology. One of his cats, upon its death, supposedly had its paw turned into a letter opener. Macabre by modern standards, but also a kind of tribute, a way to keep the animal present in his daily life. Across the Atlantic, but still very much a man of the Victorian era, Mark Twain adored cats. He lived with many of them at once, gave them elaborate names, and wrote affectionately about their intelligence and independence. His public persona, as a witty, skeptical observer of human nature, made his love of cats influential. If Mark Twain thought cats were remarkable, perhaps they were. These prominent humans did not just own cats. They talked about them, wrote about them, posed with them. Every anecdote, every story, helped shift the public imagination. The cat stopped being an anonymous background figure and started becoming a character. As cats moved closer to the human hearth, something else had to change: how they were cared for day to day. For most of history, a cat fed itself. It hunted, it scavenged, it ate what it could, when it could. Humans might throw it scraps, but there was no concept of cat food. The Victorian period did not yet have the modern kibble and canned meals that would flood the 20th century. But the foundations were being laid. Commercial dog food appeared first. Pressed biscuits marketed to urban dog owners who no longer had easy access to slaughterhouse scraps or farm offal. Soon, enterprising manufacturers realized there was a smaller, quieter market waiting. People who wanted specialized food for their cats. The first cat foods were primitive by modern nutritional standards, often just adaptations of dog biscuits or preserved meats using new industrial methods. They were not universal or even common, but they introduced the idea that cats might have their own dietary needs separate from humans and dogs. Cat litter as we know it today would not be invented until the mid-20th century, but the Victorians were already improvising indoor solutions. A truly indoor cat needed a place to relieve itself when the streets were muddy, crowded, or dangerous. Sandboxes, ash pans, piles of dirt in a corner, all rudimentary ancestors of what would become commercial cat litter. The principle was emerging. Cats could be entirely indoor animals, their needs managed within the home. Alongside food and basic facilities, other products appeared. Collars, decorative bells, grooming tools. Every new item tightened the bond between cat and owner, turning care into a routine, and routine into a relationship. Culture, as always, followed closely. Victorian literature and art are overflowing with symbolism, allegory, and moral lessons. Cats, with their elusive nature and nocturnal habits, fit easily into this symbolic world. They appeared in children's stories as sly tricksters or loyal companions. In illustrations, they lounged on hearthrugs perched on bookcases, peered from behind lace curtains. Painters captured them in domestic scenes, a sleeping child with a cat at their feet, an old woman knitting while a cat watches the fire. These images help cement the animal in the public imagination as part of the ideal home. Warmth, safety, continuity. A soft, living presence amidst the harshness of industrial life. Even when cats appeared as witches, familiars, or symbols of mystery, they were now clearly house cats, not wild spirits of the fields. Their world was made of fireplaces and staircases, not forests and deserts. Behind the scenes of all this cultural attention, another quiet bureaucracy was falling into place. Feline registries. If you want breeds, you need registries. If you want registries, you need organization. And if you want organizations, you need rules. Cat clubs formed first small and local, then national. They kept stud books, written records of cats' parentage. Breeders submitted names, lineages, descriptions. Over time, these scattered notes turned into official pedigrees, multi-generational charts showing exactly who fathered whom. It might sound like boring paperwork, but it accomplished something profound. It turned certain cats into documented individuals with official identities that extended beyond their own lifespans. A particular Tom or Queen could now influence the look and temperament of future generations long after they were gone, simply because their name on paper guided breeding decisions. In the language of genetics, it was a new kind of selective pressure layered over the old ones. In the language of history, it was the moment the cat stopped being purely the product of natural, informal human selection and became an object of deliberate design. By the end of the Victorian era, the transformation was well underway. The cat had moved from the barn to the parlor. It had been measured, classified, crossbred, and adored. Its suffering had begun to matter to strangers. Its image appeared in stories, paintings, and advertisements. Its meals and bathroom habits were slowly being systematized. The modern house cat was no longer just a shadow in the corner. It was a soft, deliberate presence, perfectly adapted to a world of rugs and curtains, tea times and ticking clocks. A creature that had survived the desert, the ship, the plague, and the superstition, now curling up on embroidered cushions at the heart of the largest empire on Earth. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the cat was about to make its ultimate leap, from useful companions and ornamental pets to fully integrated members of the modern human household. Just imagine we are in the early 1900s. The world is loud, smoky, industrial. Steam engines sigh in the rail yards, factory whistles scream at dawn. And in the shadows of all this metal and soot, there are cats. They are not pampered yet. No designer collars, no feather wands, no curated social media pages. They are working animals. Farm cats patrolling the haylofts for mice, alley cats slinking behind bakeries and butcher shops, ship cats curled up in coils of rope, sailing between continents on coal-fired freighters. They are still doing the job they started 12,000 years ago in those dusty granaries of the Fertile Crescent. Controlling pests, keeping the food supply safe. Silent employees paid in rodents. Then the world goes to war. When the First World War breaks out in 1914, humans drag every piece of their civilization into the conflict. Railroads, factories, chemistry, and, almost without planning, to cats. They slip into the trenches as if they had been there for 1,000 years. Soldiers adopt them as mascots. A kitten appears in a trench one day and never leaves. It sleeps on piles of uniforms, curls up inside helmets, strolls nonchalantly along the edge of a parapet while artillery shells whistle overhead. They are more than mascots. Rats love trenches. Mice, too. The food, the warmth, and the human waste create a rodent paradise. Disease follows. So the cats are welcomed, even cherished. Young men far from home write letters about trench cats sleeping on their chests, purring through artillery barrages. It is hard to measure what that purr meant in a landscape of fear, but you can imagine it. A small, warm body, vibrating with that deep, steady sound. A reminder that somewhere outside the mud and barbed wire, there is still softness in the world. At sea, cats are officially part of the crew. Warships and merchant vessels bring them aboard to protect precious food stocks from rats. Photographs show sailors cradling kittens on battleships, a strange contrast between tiny paws and massive guns. Some ship cats become legends in their own right. Their stories are passed from ship to ship like lucky charms. They cross oceans, survive storms, adapt to life on heaving steel decks. 5,000 years ago, their ancestors traveled on Egyptian merchant boats on the Nile. Now they are riding steel across the Atlantic. The Second World War only deepens this bond. Once again, the world fractures. Once again, humans find themselves in trenches, bunkers, and submarines. And once again, the cats follow. In bombed-out cities, people risk precious food to share scraps with neighborhood cats. Soldiers in North Africa and the Pacific name their feline companions, pose for photos with them, write about them in diaries that have survived. In an era of rationing blackouts and constant bad news, cats become tiny islands of normalcy. Something soft to touch when everything else has turned to metal and stone. But while the wars rage, another quiet revolution is gathering momentum. Not on the battlefields, but in basements and hardware stores. The year is 1947 in Michigan. A young man named Ed Lowe is working in his family's industrial absorbance business. They sell things like clay and sand to soak up oil and grease. A neighbor stops by with a problem. Her cat is using a box full of ashes as a toilet, but ashes are messy and track everywhere. She wants sand. Ed doesn't have any clean sand on hand. Instead, he offers her a bag of a special dried clay called Fuller's Earth. She takes it home. A few days later, she comes back. She wants more. The clay, she says, is incredible. It absorbs the urine, traps the odors, and doesn't turn the whole house into a gray dust storm. Ed notices something. There is a pattern here. People love their cats, but they hate the mess. If he can solve the mess, he can change how people live with cats. He starts bagging the clay and, almost as an afterthought, gives it a name. Kitty litter. Two simple words that will rewrite feline history. Before this moment, having indoor cats was possible but difficult. You needed newspapers, sand ashes, constant cleaning, and a highly elevated tolerance for smells. The easiest solution was still to let the cat roam outside, even if that meant crossing busy streets, encountering dogs, or vanishing for days. Cats were half in the house, half in the world. Commercial cat litter quietly shatters that barrier. Suddenly, you can keep a cat entirely indoors without your house smelling like a barn. Apartment dwellers in crowded cities, people without yards, families living in cold climates where opening doors in winter is brutal. Now they can all have cats comfortably inside. It is the hinge of history. The moment the cat slowly transitions from an outdoor worker to an indoor companion. At the same time, human life is transforming too. After the Second World War in many countries, particularly in the United States, there is a boom in suburban living. Cities sprawl into rings of single-family homes with lawns, sidewalks, and driveways. Garages replace stables. Supermarkets replace street markets. And in these new neighborhoods, cats reinvent themselves yet again. The farm cat moves to the backyard. The alley cat becomes the neighborhood cat, sneaking from yard to yard, lounging on porches, napping on car hoods. Inside, a different kind of feline appears, the strictly indoor pet, stretching out on couches, watching birds through picture windows, dozing on televisions, humming with the heat of vacuum tubes. The rhythm of a cat's life changes. No longer tied to barns or docks, they live in cul-de-sacs and fifth-floor walk-ups. The cats of the 19th century might have hunted in the fields. The cats of the 20th century hunt the mysterious red dot of a flashlight on the living room wall. As their role changes, human attitudes toward their health change as well. At the turn of the century, veterinary medicine was largely focused on horses, livestock, and to a lesser extent, dogs. Cats were often seen as half-wild, adaptable, and replaceable. But by the middle of the century, that shifts. As more cats move indoors and onto laps, they also move into veterinary clinics. Vaccines for common feline diseases become widely available. Vets begin to specialize in cats. They learn that feline physiology is not just that of a small dog with whiskers, but its own complex system. Conditions like feline leukemia virus and panleukopenia are identified and studied. Parasite control becomes routine, sparing countless cats from slow, silent suffering. Most transformative of all is the spread of spaying and neutering. At first, these surgical interventions are controversial. Some people think it is unnatural or worry it will change their cat's personality. But the numbers are impossible to ignore. With better food, safer homes, and less disease, Cats begin to live longer and reproduce more. Stray cats multiply in alleys and vacant lots. Shelters fill to overflowing. The dividing line between the beloved pet and the unwanted litter becomes painfully visible. Animal welfare activists, many of them starting as quiet local volunteers, begin pushing for widespread sterilization. Over the decades, spay and neuter campaigns expand. Posters go up in vet clinics and community centers. Low-cost clinics appear. By the end of the 20th century, in many places, fixing pet cats becomes the rule rather than the exception. The goal is not to control cats out of mere convenience. It is to spare future kittens from lives of hunger, disease, and abandonment. Alongside this, a new idea takes shape: the Trap, Neuter, Return Program, or TNR. Rather than simply removing stray cats and euthanizing them, volunteers humanely trap them, have them spayed or neutered, vaccinate them, and then return them to their territory with a tipped ear to mark their status. These cats can live out their lives without adding to the population. It is not a perfect solution, and debates over stray cats remain intense, but it marks a shift in mindset. Moving away from seeing stray cats purely as pests and toward considering them beings whose lives, even outside the home, have value. While all this is unfolding in the real world, another army of cats is claiming its place in a different kind of landscape: the screens of the 20th century. In the 1920s, silent cinema gives birth to one of the first global cartoon icons, Felix the cat. He is not realistic. He doesn't purr or catch mice. He shapeshifts, stretches, and breaks logic with a smug little smile. But he captures something essential about how humans perceive cats. Elastic, clever, always a bit mysterious and entirely self-possessed. At a time when most real cats are still hunting farm rats, Felix is already living full-time in the human imagination. By mid-century, Tom and Jerry burst onto television and movie screens. Tom, the eternally frustrated house cat chasing Jerry through endless slapstick battles, becomes a familiar sight in living rooms worldwide. The show isn't about real feline behavior, it's cartoon warfare. But the very premise, a cat living indoors in a modern, comfortable house, is a glimpse of a new normal. Then in 1978, a lasagna-loving orange tabby named Garfield swaggers onto the newspaper pages. Garfield doesn't hunt mice. He sleeps, eats, judges humans, and delivers sarcastic commentary on modern life. He is the ultimate domestic cat, distilled into pure attitude. By the end of the century, plush Garfields hang in car windows, and his face is printed on mugs, pajamas, and lunchboxes. Cats, once sacred in temples and feared as witches' familiars, are now selling coffee mugs with jokes about napping. But while media turns cats into symbols and punchlines, science begins asking quieter, deeper questions. What is actually going on inside that furry head? How do they land on their feet? And what exactly is a purr? Early in the century, animal behavior studies focus more on dogs, primates, and laboratory rodents. Cats are often dismissed as untrainable or aloof, and scientists ignore them. Gradually, that changes. Researchers start observing feral cat colonies, house cats, and those liminal neighborhood cats that slip between worlds. They notice social structures that are more flexible than those of pack animals, but not as solitary as once assumed. Mother cats cooperate to raise their kittens. Unrelated cats form loose alliances around reliable food sources. Purring, long assumed to be a simple sign of contentment, reveals layers. Recordings show that cats purr not just when they are happy, but also when they are injured, anxious, or even dying. Analysis reveals that the frequency of a purr often falls within a range that can promote bone healing and tissue repair in laboratory settings. Scientists begin to hypothesize. Perhaps purring is not just a signal to others, but a kind of internal therapy, a built-in healing mechanism. Cognitive studies test whether cats know their own names, follow human pointing gestures, or remember problem-solving tasks over time. The picture that emerges is subtle. Cats are not small dogs, and they do not always perform on command. But they form mental maps of their homes, track the movements of their humans by sound alone, and learn routines with impressive precision. They know when it is dinner time. They know where the treat cabinet is. They know that when the carrier appears, good things generally do not follow. As science uncovers more about what cats need to thrive, a new debate flares up, one that will only amplify in the 21st century. Should cats be allowed to roam outside? For millennia, the question never arose. A cat was an outdoor animal that might visit the indoors. But now, with traffic, high-rise buildings, and dense urban environments, the outside is more dangerous. Cars, dogs, predators, poison, and even well-meaning people who dislike animals all pose risks. Vets and animal welfare groups begin to point out that strictly indoor cats tend to live longer, safe from many common injuries and infections. At the same time, ecologists sound the alarm about cats preying on birds and small mammals, particularly in areas where local species never evolved alongside feline predators. Studies in certain regions suggest that free-roaming cats can exert heavy pressure on vulnerable wildlife populations. The cat, once the guardian of granaries and ships, is now powerful enough to reshape suburban ecosystems. And yet there is another side. Outdoor access gives many cats exercise, mental stimulation, and a chance to express their full behavioral repertoire. Climbing, stalking, exploring. For people who grew up with cats that came and went with the sunrise through a cat flap, the idea of a cat that never touches grass can feel wrong, even cruel. So the 20th century ends on a tension that is never fully resolved. On one side, safety, conservation, long lives on soft couches. On the other, freedom, risk, and the ancient thrill of the hunt. People experiment with compromises. Leash walks in closed catios, supervised yard time. But there is no single answer that satisfies everyone. What is clear is this: by the time the century closes, the domestic cat has completed an extraordinary journey. From anonymous shadows in barns to beloved family members, from working pest control to furry friends, from alley survivors to the subjects of scientific papers and Saturday morning cartoons, they still carry the instincts of their wild ancestors in every pounce and tail flick. But their world has shrunk and deepened, moving from open fields and harbor docks to living rooms, bedrooms, and sunny windowsills. They have moved slowly and silently from the margins of human life to its very center. And in the glow of late-night television, while the outside world hums with cars and neon, a cat curls up at the foot of a bed, purring. 10,000 years of shared history contained in the rise and fall of a sleeping chest. A soft paw flexing against a blanket, a sound like distant thunder rumbling in miniature. The stage is set for their next conquest. Not just our homes, but our screens, our cameras, our entire digital imagination. Picture the screen in front of you. A pale rectangle of light in a dark room. You are tired. Your brain is buzzing with half-finished tasks, unanswered emails, and vague worries about tomorrow. You don't want a lecture. You don't want breaking news. You just want something gentle, something simple, something that asks nothing of you. So you open a video. A cat appears. It blinks. It misjudges a jump. It squeaks instead of meowing. And suddenly, without quite knowing why, you feel your shoulders drop. Your breathing slows. Your mind, which has been spinning in circles all day, begins to track a single little animal walking across a kitchen floor. This is where our story has led us. 12,000 years after wildcats slipped into the very first granaries, after Egypt carved them into stone, after sailors smuggled them onto ships and Victorians brought them into parlors. Cats have discovered a new habitat, the internet. They didn't plan it, they never do. But look at the numbers, and it is hard to escape the conclusion. In the digital age, cats might be the most successful non-human influencers on Earth. Before there were platforms, algorithms, and content strategies, there were message boards, dial-up modems, and grainy digital cameras that stored 20 photos if you were lucky. People were already sharing cat stories back then. Descriptions of strange habits, low-resolution photos of orange tabbies sleeping in shoeboxes, little textual shrines to specific cats that no one outside a tight circle would ever meet in person. Then in the early 2000s, something changed. Image hosting became easier. Bandwidth increased. Suddenly you could share not just a description of your cat, but its actual face, its posture, the exact way its ears tilted when it was confused. From there emerged an entire internet dialect, lolcats. Photos of cats with blocky white text pasted over them in deliberately broken English. Icon has cheeseburger. Ceiling cat is watching you. It was nonsense and parody, and in a strange way, a form of storytelling. Millions of people scattered across the globe took their intensely personal affection for a single animal sleeping on their couch and turned it into a shared language. Then came YouTube. If photos could capture a cat's stillness, Videos could capture everything else. The chaos, the sudden explosive gravity-defying sprints at 3 in the morning, the suspicion of cucumbers, the determination to sit in boxes that were clearly too small, and the shock when it somehow worked anyway. Cat videos became one of the first truly global genres of online content. Before professional creators dominated the platform, before brands and studios carved out territories, there were shaky, short clips simply titled, "My Cat Doing Weird Stuff" or "Funniest Cat Ever," viewed millions of times, forwarded from inbox to inbox, embedded on countless blogs. As social media matured, cats followed. Facebook feeds filled with photos of adopted kittens. Twitter accounts narrated life from a cat's perspective. Instagram feeds that were nothing but a single cat in different sunbeams day after day. Platforms shifted, algorithms evolved, but the pattern remained constant. Give humans the ability to share fragments of their lives at scale, and very quickly, those fragments fill up with cats. Some of these cats became something new. Not just pets, not just companions, but celebrities. Grumpy Cat, whose real name was Tartar Sauce, appeared first as a single photograph. A small cat with an expression of permanent displeasure due to a combination of feline dwarfism and an underbite. The internet turned that face into a mirror, reflecting every irritated emotion people didn't feel safe expressing. Nope, I had fun once. It was awful. Within a few years, Grumpy Cat had merchandise lines, book deals, and made public appearances. Journalists interviewed her owner. Photographers chased her down convention hallways. A single cat, who had no idea any of this was happening, generated millions of dollars in economic activity. Lil Bub followed another path. A tiny tongue permanently sticking out of a jaw malformed by genetic conditions. She looked like a creature from a children's storybook. People responded not just to her cuteness, but to her visible vulnerability. Her owner used that attention to raise money for animal charities and shelters. An unlikely star turned into a force for funding veterinary care and adoption programs. A disabled cat that might have been quietly euthanized in another era became a global symbol of resilience and sweetness. In Japan, Maru climbed into boxes. That was it, over and over again. Long cardboard boxes, tiny cardboard boxes, boxes that clearly could not hold him, except that somehow, through sheer determination and alarming flexibility, they did. Those videos drew tens of millions of views. He became so popular that researchers actually studied why people loved watching him so much. The answer was deceptively simple. It made them feel good, calm, amused, but in a quiet, low-stress way. This is one of the mysteries of the digital age. In a world overflowing with big-budget entertainment special effects and carefully engineered addictive content, why do so many people choose, again and again, to watch a cat play with a crumpled receipt? Psychologists have some ideas. When you see something cute, a round face, big eyes, a small body, your brain activates circuits originally tuned for infant care, nurturing responses, protective instincts. These circuits are deeply hardwired. It is about survival, not logic. A kitten tumbling off a couch onto a soft rug can trigger the same rush of tenderness as a human baby reaching for your finger. At the same time, cat videos are low stakes. The plot is never complicated. The outcome is rarely tragic. You can watch for 10 seconds or 10 minutes and move on easily. Compared to a news feed full of conflict and crisis, a cat trying to catch a laser pointer is an emotional breath of fresh air, a tiny portable pocket of safety. Studies suggest that people who watch cat videos report less stress, more positive emotions, and even a little relief from guilt and anxiety. It is not therapy in a clinical sense, but it is soothing, predictable, shareable. You send a cat clip to a friend and you are not just sharing entertainment, you are sending a little wordless message. Take a break, breathe. Here is something soft. While the internet was busy turning cats into memes and minor deities, scientists were quietly using digital tools for a different purpose. Understanding cats as a species better than ever before. Geneticists began sequencing cat DNA at scale. House cats from different continents, feral cats from islands and ports, show cats from carefully tracked lineages. When they compared all these genomes, patterns emerged. They could see the signature of those first domestication events in the Near East, 10 to 12,000 years ago. They could see how cats hitchhiked along trade routes, their genes spreading from the grain stores of the Fertile Crescent to the ports of the Mediterranean, then along shipping lanes to Asia, Africa, and finally the Americas and Oceania. An invisible migration traced not by pottery fragments and stone tools, but by infusions of DNA. Modern studies suggest that almost all domestic cats on Earth today descend from a single wild ancestor species, Felis sylvestris libica, the Near Eastern wildcat. As empires rose and fell, as languages shifted and religions transformed, the cats kept moving. Now in the age of spreadsheets and satellites, we can finally map their journey with some precision. Every hair you sweep off your couch carries a barcode of history. Scientists are also using data to explore the human-cat bond. Surveys heart rate, monitors, brain imaging experiments. They show something cat owners have long suspected. Cats notice us. They track our movements, our routines, the tone of our voices. They recognize their names, even if they choose to ignore them. They form attachments that in many cases look strikingly similar to those of human infants toward their caregivers. Not always, not every cat, but often enough to be more than just a coincidence. All of this is unfolding against a backdrop of a number that would have stunned those early farmers who let wildcats into their granaries. By many estimates, there are now hundreds of millions of cats in the world. Some live in apartments and houses, eating carefully formulated diets and visiting vets for regular checkups. Others live on farms and in workshops in a semi-wild state, tolerated as long as they catch mice. Millions more inhabit the spaces in between: alleys, docks, vacant lots, urban parks. Some are fed by volunteers, others rely on scavenging and hunting. This global feline population has become the center of new ethical debates. Cats that go outside, particularly in places where native wildlife evolved without feline predators, can cause significant ecological damage. Songbirds, small mammals, reptiles. In some regions, ecologists argue that free-roaming domestic cats rank among the most destructive invasive species on Earth. That is one perspective. On the other side, many cat advocates argue that cats are now so deeply woven into human society that treating them simply as invasive animals misses the point. They didn't choose to be scattered across islands and suburbs. We brought them. We bred them. We created the conditions they live in today. The responsibility, they say, falls on us to manage them humanely. From this tension emerged practices like trap, neuter, return, where feral cats are caught, sterilized, vaccinated, and released back into their territory, with the goal of stabilizing and gradually reducing colony sizes without mass culling. Supporters point to shrinking populations in certain areas. Critics worry that even stable colonies maintain predation pressure on vulnerable species. And so the debate continues, playing out at city council meetings, academic conferences, and in online comment sections. Inside homes, ethical questions take other forms. Should cats be kept strictly indoors, where they are safer from cars, predators, and disease, but confined to a limited space? Or should they be allowed to roam to express natural behaviors, even if it shortens their lives and threatens wildlife? Is it responsible to buy certain designer breeds deliberately created for a particular look, flattened faces, hairlessness, extremely short legs, when those traits can come with chronic health issues and discomfort? Some argue that any deliberate breeding in a world full of homeless cats is morally questionable. Others maintain that ethical, health-focused breeding can improve overall feline welfare. These are not exactly new questions. People have debated animals and ethics for centuries. What is new is the scale and the speed. A viral post about a kitten mill, a controversial breed, or an urban cat call can be seen by millions of people in a matter of hours. The internet that made cats famous has also made them a focal point for discussions about what kind of relationship humans want to have with the rest of the living world. Then in 2020, another event brought this relationship into sharper focus. A pandemic, lockdowns, closed offices, deserted streets, people suddenly confined to their homes, facing an invisible threat and an uncertain future. Loneliness became a global public health crisis. Screens were our primary connection to work friends and everything outside our walls. In that anxious silence, countless people welcomed cats. Shelters reported surges in adoptions and fostering. Waitlists formed for kittens. Older, harder-to-place cats that had been passed over for months were suddenly going home. People who had delayed adopting because of travel or office hours realized they might never have this much time at home again. Daily life shifted. Video meetings began with the usual greetings, then a pause while everyone admired the tabby that had just walked across someone's keyboard. Entire compilations of cats interrupting Zoom calls appeared, turning awkwardness into shared laughter at a time when many forms of physical closeness were risky. The warm weight of an animal sleeping beside you took on a new significance. Researchers studying mental health during the pandemic found that pets, including cats, were frequently cited as crucial sources of comfort. The routine feeding, grooming, playing gave structure to days that might otherwise have blurred together. Petting fur lowered heart rates and stress hormones. The simple knowledge that another living being was in the room, breathing, blinking occasionally, demanding food at exactly the wrong moment, anchored people who felt adrift. If the agricultural revolution gave us cats as grain guards, and the Victorian era gave us cats as cherished indoor companions, the pandemic period highlighted another role. Cats as co-isolated partners, sharing a very modern kind of uncertainty. And beyond the present moment, the future of cats continues to take shape. Biotechnology is probing the edges of what is possible. Cloning services offer for a hefty price to create genetic copies of beloved cats that have died. The result looks similar, sometimes uncannily so, but it is not the same individual. Behavior and personality are shaped by far more than DNA, by chance, by environment, by the subtle interactions that begin at birth. Yet for some grieving owners, the idea of continuity remains compelling. Gene editing raises other possibilities. Could we, in theory, design cats that are hypoallergenic, or that don't hunt wildlife, or that are resistant to common diseases? Technically, perhaps. But ethically, the questions are far more complex. At what point does a cat shaped and sculpted by human preference at the genetic level become something fundamentally different from the opportunistic wildcats that first slipped into our storage pits? At the same time, more ordinary forms of the cat of the future are already emerging. Breeds adapted for apartment living. Interactive toys and food dispensers that connect to smartphones. GPS collars and health monitors that upload data to the cloud. Somewhere right now, a person on another continent can open an app, watch a live video feed of their cat napping in a sunbeam, and dispense a treat remotely. The species that once survived by stalking mice under the starlight is now in many homes, watched over by infrared cameras and machine learning algorithms that track its movement patterns. A vet might one day diagnose arthritis or heart disease, not by waiting for visible symptoms, but by analyzing months of subtle behavioral data gathered automatically from the cat's daily life. And through it all, through the memes and the merchandise, the genetic maps, and the ethical arguments, cats remain what they have always been. Velvet-pawed predators that somehow found a way to live among us without ever entirely belonging to us. On your screen, a video loops. A kitten chases its tail, spinning awkwardly until it tips over, blinking with unbothered confusion. On your couch, perhaps a real cat curls into a tighter circle, tail over nose, ears twitching at sounds you cannot hear. From the first granaries to fiber optic cables, from torches to touchscreens, we have watched them. And in their own quiet way, they have watched us right back. Imagine this, somewhere 12,000 years ago in a dark granary at the edge of the first wheat fields, a small wildcat slips through the shadows. It is not there for humans. It is not there for friendship. It is there for the mice, for survival by instinct. Now imagine this. Tonight, that exact same lineage is curled at the foot of your bed, or pressed against your pillow, or sprawled across your laptop, refusing to move. The eyes are the same shape. The teeth are the same. The hunter's brain is still running in the background, but the world around the cat has changed beyond recognition. And somehow, through it all, the cat has been part of the journey. For 12,000 years, cats have walked a strange path alongside us. Not quite livestock, not quite tools, never entirely under our control. Dogs were sculpted by human intention, generation after generation shaped into guards, herders, helpers. Cats did something different. They watched us. They approached on their own terms. They chose themselves. Even today, a domestic cat is astonishingly close to its wild cousins. The genes of a tabby in your living room and a Near Eastern wildcat stalking a rocky hillside are incredibly similar. The skeleton is nearly identical. The hunting sequence, stalk, freeze, wiggle the hindquarters, pounce, is ancient, intact. You can see it when a kitten chases a crumpled receipt. You can see 10,000 years before our era in your hallway at 3 in the morning. That is the strange magic of cat domestication. We didn't really domesticate them the way we did cows, horses, or sheep. We created an opportunity. Granaries full of rodents, villages full of shelter, ships full of food scraps. Cats stepped into that niche. The boldest ones, the slightly more tolerant ones, the ones that could put up with our clumsy affection and our noisy homes. They thrived. Over time, they became smaller, more varied in color, a little more social, but never fully tamed. They remain, in a very real sense, ambassadors of the wild, living inside our houses. And in return for a place at the edge of our fires, they gave us far more than we usually notice. They gave us pest control long before the term existed. On the Nile, they kept the grain from the rat's teeth, protecting the food supply of entire kingdoms. On merchant ships, they patrolled the holds and saved sailors from starvation in distant seas. In medieval streets, in barns and cellars, they were the silent line between stored harvests and ruin. But they also gave us something softer, something harder to measure in numbers, in bones, in coins. Companionship. The slow blink from across the room that looks curiously like trust. The warm weight on your chest after a hard day. The soft purr vibrating in the dark when the rest of the world feels uncertain. For centuries, people have written about cats as guardians of dreams, keepers of secrets, silent witnesses to our private lives. They sat beside Egyptian scribes under oil lamps, curled beneath the chairs of Roman philosophers, hid under the benches of medieval taverns, posed stiffly in Victorian portraits, and then centuries later exploded into countless GIFs and ridiculous videos looping endlessly on phone screens across the planet. From sacred statues and temples to internet reaction memes, cats have remained themselves, independent, impassive, occasionally affectionate, frequently mysterious. And that mystery is part of why we cannot look away. Other domestic animals offer us devotion, obedience, clear emotional signals. Cats offer us ambiguity, a twitch of the tail that could mean irritation or excitement, a sudden midnight sprint that might be play, or an ancient desert hunter rehearsing for a life it will never need to lead. We project stories into those silences. We wonder what they are thinking as they stare into corners we cannot see. In every era, this combination of closeness and distance has fascinated us. A creature that lives in our homes but seems to belong in some way to another world. And yet, despite all the legends, all the superstitions, all the centuries of fear and adoration, the fundamental relationship is simple. We offer them shelter, food, warmth, and a place to sleep in the sun. They give us a little control over the pests that would eat our food. They offer a calming presence in lonely rooms. They give us something to care for that is never entirely ours. They bring us laughter, comfort, heartbreak, and the soft echo of the wild grasslands in every purr. If you have come this far in the story, through the ancient fields, the temple walls, the plague-ridden streets, the Victorian parlors, and all the way to the digital age, thank you for sharing this journey through 12,000 years of purring. If you would like to keep exploring quiet histories like this one, you can gently tap the like button and subscribe to join our little community here. It helps more than you might guess, and it allows us to keep creating long, calm stories for you to fall asleep to. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. A city apartment, a dorm room, a farmhouse, a ship at sea. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment with your country or city. And if you have a cat, tell us their name and perhaps a little story about them. Somewhere else, someone drifting off to sleep might be reading along with their own cat tucked under the blankets. If you want to go a step further, there is also an optional channel membership here on YouTube. It is never expected, but it is deeply appreciated. Members help support the time and research that go into these long, quiet journeys, and any support of any kind, including simply watching and resting, is received with real gratitude. For now, wherever you are, lights dimmed, headphones on, a cat purring nearby, or just the memory of one, I hope your mind feels a little more settled, a little quieter, knowing the path that led those soft paws to your pillow. From the wild edges of the first farms to the quiet of your room tonight. Thank you for spending this time exploring the history of cats. Rest well, and may your dreams be accompanied by a soft, steady purr.